Hi guys, this is Uncle Sam, and today, Uncle
Today, Uncle Dad.
Uncle Dad. No, you can just keep it rolling. We can cut it. Hi guys, this is Uncle Sam, and today Grandpa is going to read you a story called "The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins" by Dr. Seuss. So this is a special story time for you guys, for you, Lana, Audrey, Eden, and Anna. Do you want me to do it again?
Thanks, Sam.
No? Okay. Bye, guys.
Okay, after that exciting introduction, it's time for the story, and it's going to be a really good story. This is one of my favorites, and I think you'll enjoy it too. The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins by Dr. Seuss. So here we go. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and the plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. So here's a picture of the hat with the feather that points straight up in the air. Well, the kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high up on the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all his subjects. First, over the spires of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich men's mansions, then over the little houses of the townsfolk to the huts of the farmers far off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. See, look at his view that he has. You can see a long ways. Well, far off in the fields, on the edge of a cranberry bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townsfolk, then to the rich men's mansions and the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that King Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backward. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. See, look at that. That's his view. Way up in the mountain is the palace. Just after sunrise, one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He was very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand, he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gate of the town. Here he is, walking faster and faster, and the sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the cobbled streets when he got to town. "Clear the way! Clear the way! Make way for the king!" What's going on here? Everybody rushed for the sidewalk. They drove their carts right up over the curbstone. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them on crimson-robed horses came the king's own guards. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow street. It swept right past Bartholomew, and then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked, and it lurched and stopped, and the whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up," the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guard shouted to their crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly the procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. There's the king, and he doesn't look very happy. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. "Well? Well?" he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. "I ought to say something," he thought, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "Well?" the king demanded again. "Do you or do you not take off your hat before the king?" "Oh, yes, indeed, sire," answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. "I do take off my hat before the king." "Then take it off this very instant," commanded the king. "But, sire, my hat is off," said Bartholomew. "Such impudence!" shouted the king, shaking an angry finger. "How dare you say there and tell me your hat is off?" I'd like to say you're wrong, sire," said Bartholomew very politely, "but you see my hat is off." And he showed the king the hat in his hand. "If that's the hat in your hand," demanded the king, "what's that on your head?" "On my head?" There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up and he touched a hat. "Look at that!" Oh my. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. "It's a hat, sire," he stammered, but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head." "Well, I don't care how it got there," said the king. "You take it off." And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew snatched off the hat, and he stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat, the same size and the same color, and exactly the same feather. "By the crown of my fathers," roared the king, again leaning out of the carriage window, "did I or did I not command you to take off your hat?" "Oh, you did, sire, and I took it off. I took it off twice." "Nonsense! There's still a hat on your head." "Another hat?" Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched another hat. Come, what is the meaning of all this?" demanded the king. His face was purple with rage. "I don't know, sire," answered Bartholomew. "It never happened to me before." The king was now shaking with such fury the carriage rocked on its wheels, and the royal coachman could hardly sit in his seat. "Arrest this impudent trickster," shouted the king to the captain of the king's own guards. "We'll teach him to take off his hat." There's Bartholomew, and he looks very confused. The royal coachman cracked his whip, and the king's carriage swung forward up the street toward the palace. The captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced over the cobblestones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jangling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street toward the palace. Out of the narrow streets, up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back, and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, past the walls of the noblemen's castles. And you know what happened as they were riding up to the castle? Flip! A sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flip, flip! 2 more flipped off. Flip, flip, flip! Some more! 4, 5, 6, 7! Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of their turrets, wondering what that strange stream of hats could mean. Look at him. Look at the hats falling off his head. Over the palace drawbridge they sped, through the great gates, into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. "His Majesty waits in the throne room," said a guard, saluting the captain. "The throne room?" The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. "I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king could do nothing dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. "Follow the black carpet," said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind the doors. He won't take off his hat? No, he won't take off his hat. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king in a long scarlet robe was sitting on his throne, and beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. The lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. See, there's Lord Alaric right there with the ruler in his belt, and the whole courtyard, and Bartholomew down at the end. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for your king?" "Well, your majesty," said Bartholomew as politely as he could, "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." He took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off the hat, and another hat, and another hat, until he was standing in the middle of a pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. "Heavens," said Sir Alaric, blinking behind his spectacles. "He's taken off 45. Look, see, he's counting." "And there were 3 more down in the town," said the king. "And you must add 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, who was trying to be as helpful as he could. 135 hats. Most unusual, said Sir Alaric, writing it down on a long scroll. Come, come, said the king impatiently. Sir Alaric, what do you make of this nonsense? Oh, this is very serious nonsense, your majesty. I advise you to call in an expert on the hats. Excellent idea, agreed the king. Ho, God, fetch in Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords. Into the throne room marched the smallest man wearing the tallest hat Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. There he is, walking in with his scissors. Take a look at this boy's hat, commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubben's hat, and he sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth of gold, fine silks, gems, and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pah, it's the most ordinary hat I ever set eyes on. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take it off. Pah, simple indeed, mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. And immediately, another hat appeared on Bartholomew's head. Screebies! Screamed Sir Snips, leaping in the air higher than he was tall. And then he turned and ran shrieking out of the throne room. Ha! Look at him go! Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. That's 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. Your Majesty, I advise you to call in your wise men. Oh, fine idea. Ho, guard, bring me Nad. Nad knows everything in all my kingdom. In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nad, my wise man, can you take off his hat? Asked the king. Nad shook his head. No. Then fetch me the father of Nad, commanded the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom and all the world beyond. In came an even older man, but when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. Then bring me the father of Nad, ordered the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom, in all the world beyond, and in all other worlds that there may happen to be. Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. Look at him. He doesn't know what to do. Does this mean there is no one in my whole